Welcome back, traveler. We've journeyed together through 20 ghost towns now, from the highest peaks to the lowest marshes, from desert heat to mountain cold. Each place has whispered its secrets to us, stories of hope and heartbreak, prosperity and ruin, community and abandonment. Tonight, we explore 5 more forgotten places, and this time we venture into new territory. We'll walk through the towering forests of the Pacific Northwest, where logging towns rose and fell with the timber. We'll visit New England mill towns where rivers once powered the Industrial Revolution. We'll stand in company towns where corporations controlled every aspect of life. These are stories of different industries, different landscapes, different eras, but always the same human drama of building something from nothing and watching it fade away. So settle in one more time. Let the weight of the day fall away. Close your eyes and let these stories carry you through the American landscape, through time, through the endless cycle of creation and decay that defines our history. The ghosts are waiting, patient as always, ready to share their tales with anyone willing to listen. Part 1. Molson, Washington, the town that moved. Birth on the border. Molson sits, or sat, right on the Canadian border in north-central Washington, in the rugged Okanagan Highlands. Gold was discovered in the area in the 1890s, and prospectors flooded in from both the United States and Canada. A mining camp sprang up, and by 1900 it had evolved into a proper town with about 300 residents. What made Molson unusual was its location, straddling the international border. The original town site was actually in Canada, but most of the mining claims were on the American side. This created confusion about which country's laws applied, what taxes were owed, and who had jurisdiction over disputes. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. The town had everything a mining community needed: hotels, saloons, general stores, a newspaper called the Molson Advocate, a school, and even a brewery. There was a bank, essential for a mining town where ore and cash constantly changed hands. The mines in the surrounding hills employed hundreds of men, and Molson was the supply and social center for the entire district. It's a big move. In 1905, facing ongoing legal and tax complications from being in 2 countries, the business owners made an extraordinary decision. They would move the entire town across the border into the United States, and they did. Buildings were literally jacked up, put on skids or wagons, and hauled about a mile south to a new town site entirely within Washington. The move took weeks. Imagine watching your entire town migrate, the hotel sliding past on logs pulled by teams of horses, the general store creaking along on a wagon, the saloon relocating with bottles still on the shelves. It must have been quite a sight. The new Molson was laid out with wider streets and better planning than the original. And for a few years, it seemed the move would usher in a new era of prosperity. The old town site across the border was abandoned, or mostly abandoned. A few buildings remained, creating the odd situation of 2 Molsons, Old Molson in Canada and New Molson in the United States, separated by just a mile and an international boundary. Brief prosperity. For about a decade after the move, New Molson thrived. The mines continued producing gold, though not in the quantities of the boom years. The Great Northern Railway built a branch line that reached nearby, but not directly to Molson, making transportation somewhat easier. The town had electricity, telephone service, and regular mail delivery. It seemed settled and permanent, but the gold was finite, and by the 1910s, the best ore was depleted. The mines began closing one by one. Some operations continued at a reduced scale, keeping hope alive, but the boom was clearly over. World War I brought temporary revival as metal prices spiked, but after the war ended, the decline resumed. The town began to empty. Young people left for opportunities in Seattle, Spokane, or the farming valleys to the south. Families packed up when the mines where fathers worked finally closed. Businesses shut down as their customer base disappeared. The bank closed its doors. The newspaper published its last edition. The school, once filled with children's voices, fell silent. Ghost town times 2. Today, both Molsons exist as ghost towns. Old Molson, across the border in Canada, has scattered ruins and foundations. New Molson in Washington has several buildings still standing, including the old schoolhouse, false front store, and a few houses. The site is maintained as an outdoor museum of sorts, though it's not officially a park, just a collection of old buildings on private property that the owners allow visitors to see. The setting is beautiful: rolling hills covered with pine and fir, open meadows, big sky, and a sense of remoteness that defines this part of Washington. In summer, wildflowers bloom around the old buildings. In winter, snow buries everything, and the ghost town sleeps under a white blanket, just as it did when miners still worked the hills. Standing in Molson today, you can look north toward where old Molson once stood, across that invisible line that caused so much trouble. The town tried to solve its problems by moving, by starting over in a new location with better legal standing. And for a while, it worked. But in the end, geography wasn't the problem. Economics was, and you can't move away from exhausted gold mines. Part 2. Fayette, Michigan, iron smelting on the peninsula. Industrial outpost. Fayette, Michigan, was a company town built by the Jackson Iron Company on the Garden Peninsula, jutting into Lake Michigan. It wasn't a mining town exactly, it was a smelting town. Iron ore from nearby mines was brought to Fayette to be smelted into pig iron using charcoal produced from the surrounding hardwood forests. The location was chosen carefully. It had a good harbor on Big Bay de Nocquare, ore and supplies could be delivered by boat. It had unlimited timber for producing charcoal. It had limestone deposits needed for the smelting process. And it was far enough from civilization that the company could control every aspect of workers' lives. Construction began in 1867, and within a few years, Fayette was a complete industrial complex. Its blast furnaces operated around the clock, fed by teams of workers on rotating shifts. Charcoal kilns, massive beehive-shaped stone structures, turned hardwood into the charcoal fuel that fed the furnaces. Docks handled the constant traffic of ore boats arriving and iron boats departing. Company town life. Fayette was, in every sense, a company town. The Jackson Iron Company owned everything: the houses, the store, the hotel, even the land under the cemetery. Workers were paid in company scrip that could only be spent at the company store, where prices were inflated. There was no competition, no alternative, no escape from the company's control. About 500 people lived in Fayette at its peak. There were skilled workers, the furnace operators, the engineers, the master carpenters. There were unskilled laborers who fed charcoal into the furnaces, hauled ore, and did the heavy work. There were woodcutters who felled trees in the surrounding forest and tended the charcoal kilns, quays, and there were the families, wives, and children who created community despite the company's dominance. Life revolved entirely around the furnaces. The blast furnaces ran continuously, day and night, 24 hours a day. They couldn't be allowed to cool down, or the molten iron inside would solidify and ruin the furnace. Meant constant shifts of workers at all hours, in all weather. Fang, the glow of the furnaces lit up the night. The roar of the blast and the hammering of the casting house never stopped. For workers, life was hard, but relatively stable. The company provided housing, small but weathertight. The work was dangerous and exhausting, especially in summer when furnace temperatures made the work areas hellish. But the pay was regular, and in a frontier region with few opportunities, that counted for a lot. Children attended school in a building the company provided. The company doctor treated injuries and illnesses. The company store sold necessities at high prices, but at least they were available. It was a closed system, entirely self-sufficient, cut off from the outside world by miles of forest and water. Forest exhaustion. The Jackson Iron Company produced high-quality pig iron at Fayette for over 20 years, but the operation depended on an unlimited supply of hardwood for charcoal production. Each ton of pig iron required enormous amounts of charcoal, and each unit of charcoal required vast quantities of wood. The furnaces consumed the forest at an unsustainable rate. By the late 1880s, the easily accessible timber within reasonable hauling distance was exhausted. Workers had to go farther and farther into the forest to find hardwood, making charcoal production increasingly expensive and difficult. At the same time, new smelting technologies using coke instead of charcoal were making operations like Fayette obsolete. In 1891, the Jackson Iron Company made the cold calculation that Fayette was no longer profitable. The furnaces were shut down, allowed to cool for the first time in over 2 decades. Workers were given short notice to vacate their company-owned homes. Within weeks, Fayette went from a functioning industrial town to a ghost town. Its preserved industrial heritage. Today, Fayette is a Michigan State Historic Park, remarkably well preserved. Many buildings still stand, including the massive limestone blast furnace structures, charcoal kilns, the company office, workers' homes, the hotel, and various industrial buildings. The harbor is still there, peaceful now, without the constant traffic of or boats. Walking through Fayette, you get a vivid sense of 19th century industrial life. The scale of the operation is impressive. Those blast furnaces and kilns represent enormous investment and ambition. But you also sense the human cost, the workers who lived their entire lives under company control, who worked brutal shifts in dangerous conditions, who had no choices and few rights. The setting is beautiful. Okay? The Garden Peninsula is one of Michigan's most scenic areas, with the waters of Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon. Forested hills rolling inland and limestone cliffs framing the harbor. Nature has softened what humans built. Grass grows around the furnaces. Okay. Trees shade the old streets. Okay. The industrial noise has been replaced by wind, waves, and birdsong. Fayette reminds us that not all ghost towns were romantic frontier settlements. Some were industrial operations, places where workers were resources to be used, where profit mattered more than people, where entire communities could be created and destroyed by corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms. Part 3. Gilman, Colorado. Toxic legacy, silver and zinc in the Rockies. Gilman, Colorado, perched on a clifftop above the Eagle River in the Central Rockies, was founded in the 1880s when silver was discovered in the area. The town was built on Battle Mountain at about 8,900 feet elevation in a spectacular but challenging location. Buildings clung to the steep slopes, and mining tunnels honeycombed the mountain beneath the town. After the silver panic of 1893, mining shifted focus from silver to zinc and other base metals. The mines proved extraordinarily rich in zinc, and Gilman evolved from a rough silver camp into a substantial mining town. By the early 1900s, it had several hundred residents and all the infrastructure of a proper community. The New Jersey Zinc Company eventually consolidated ownership of the mines and the town itself, making Gilman another company town. But unlike some company towns with their harsh reputation, Gilman was considered one of the better places to work. The company provided good housing, maintained the infrastructure, and paid competitive wages. Families lived there for generations. Life on the cliff. Living in Gilman meant adapting to extreme conditions. The town was literally built on the side of a cliff, with buildings stacked on terraces carved into the rock. Some homes were built over mine shafts, and you could feel the vibration of the mining operations below. Vegetation provided stunning views, but also meant everything had to be hauled up steep grades. Winter was intense. Snow could begin in September and last into May. Avalanches were a constant threat, and several homes and buildings were destroyed over the years by slides. The elevation meant the air was thin, and newcomers struggled with altitude sickness. But for those born and raised there, it was simply home. The mines employed several hundred workers at peak operations. Multiple ships kept the mines running around the clock. Ore was extracted through an elaborate system of tunnels, shafts, and haulageways that extended deep into the mountain and far beneath the town itself. The scale of the underground operation was enormous. Miles of tunnels at various levels, all connected, all necessary to reach the zinc-bearing ore. The community was tight-knit by necessity. In an isolated mountain town, your neighbors were your lifeline. There was a school, a post office, stores, a hotel, and even a movie theater. Social life revolved around community events, school functions, and the annual celebrations that brought everyone together. Children grew up tough and independent, learning to navigate the steep slopes and deal with the altitude. Environmental disaster. By the 1970s, environmental awareness was growing, and people began paying closer attention to mining's impact. Studies revealed that a century of mining had contaminated the area around Gilman with heavy metals, zinc, lead, cadmium, and other toxins. The Eagle River, running through the valley below, was severely polluted. The groundwater was contaminated. Even the soil in town contained dangerous levels of heavy metals. The contamination posed serious health risks to residents, especially children. The New Jersey Zinc Company faced mounting pressure from environmental regulators and the possibility of massive cleanup costs. In 1984, the company made the decision to close the mines permanently and evacuate the town. Unlike most ghost town abandonments that happened gradually over years, Gilman's evacuation was organized and relatively quick. Residents were given time to pack and move, but within a few months, the town was empty. The company sealed the mine entrances, shut off utilities, and closed the only road leading into town. Gilman became one of America's newest ghost towns, abandoned not because the ore was depleted, but because the environmental damage was too severe, sealed, and toxic. Today, Gilman is off limits. The road is blocked, and the town is fenced and posted with no trespassing signs. It remains property of the mining company now, Fayette, through corporate acquisitions, and access is prohibited due to safety and environmental hazards. The abandoned buildings are deteriorating, and the entire site is a Superfund toxic waste cleanup location. From a distance, you can see the ghost town clinging to its clifftop, buildings slowly collapsing, nature trying to reclaim what humans built. But nature's work is slow here. The contamination makes it difficult for vegetation to reestablish. It's a wounded landscape, scarred by a century of industrial extraction. Gilman represents a darker side of mining history, the long-term environmental consequences of extracting wealth from the earth. The zinc that was mined enriched investors and provided jobs for workers, but it also poisoned the land, water, and air. The town that seemed so permanent, so established, was ultimately abandoned because humans had made it unlivable. The story of Gilman is still unfolding. Cleanup efforts continue, slowly and expensively. There's talk of eventually redeveloping the site, but the contamination is so extensive that full cleanup may take decades or longer. For now, Gilman stands as a sealed ghost town, a toxic monument to industrial extraction and environmental neglect. Part 4. Speculator, New York, Adirondack, Ghost. Logging in the Great North Woods. Speculator, New York, isn't completely abandoned, but its story as a once thriving logging town that shrank to a shadow of itself makes it a ghost town in spirit. Located deep in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, Speculator was founded in the late 1700s, but it boomed in the mid-1800s as a logging center. The Adirondacks were covered with massive old-growth forests, towering white pines, hemlocks, and hardwoods that had stood for centuries. As demand for timber grew to feed America's expansion, logging companies moved into the region. Speculator became a key logging town, with sawmills, timber processing, and river driving operations that sent logs down to markets downstate. At its peak, in the late 1800s, Speculator had over 1,000 residents, a substantial town by Adirondack standards. The sound of saws echoed through the valleys constantly. River drives in spring sent thousands of logs floating down the Sacandoga River toward markets. The woods were full of logging camps where men spent winters cutting trees, living in rough camps far from town, enduring brutal conditions for wages. The logger's life. Adirondack logging was brutal work. Men worked from before dawn to after dark, 6 or 7 days a week in all weather. In winter, the prime logging season, temperatures could drop to 30 or 40 below zero. Hands would freeze to axe handles. Feet would go numb in boots that were never quite dry. Frostbite, injuries from falling trees, and accidents with saws claimed lives regularly. The logging camps were rough. Bunkhouses where men slept packed together. Basic food, no comforts. But the pay was relatively good by rural standards, and for men with a few other options, logging provided a living. Many were immigrants, Irish, French Canadian, Italian, drawn to America by the promise of work and willing to endure harsh conditions to get established. In spring, the river drives were spectacular and dangerous. When the ice broke up, logs that had been cut and stockpiled through winter were pushed into the rivers. Log drivers, skilled men who could walk, run, and even dance on floating logs, guided the timber downstream, breaking up log jams and keeping the drive moving. It was skilled, dangerous work. Men drowned when they fell between logs or got caught in jams. But it was also thrilling, a test of skill and courage. Speculator was the social center where loggers came when they came down from the camps. The town had numerous hotels and boarding houses, saloons, stores, churches, and schools. On Saturday nights, the town would be full of loggers with money in their pockets, eager to drink, gamble, and enjoy civilization after weeks in the woods. The town could be rough. Fights were common, and the jail saw regular use. Forest exhaustion. By the early 1900s, the great Adirondack forests were devastated. The massive old-growth trees that had taken centuries to grow were gone, replaced by slash. The branches and debris left behind eroded hillsides. Rivers that had once run clear were choked with bark and sawdust. Forest fires swept through regularly, feeding on the dry slash. Public outcry over the destruction led to the creation of the Adirondack Forest Preserve and eventually Adirondack Park, protecting what remained and allowing the forests to recover. But this meant the end of large-scale logging. The sawmills closed. The logging camps were abandoned. The river drives ended. Speculator's population crashed. From over 1,000 at its peak, it fell to just a few hundred. Young people left for cities or for logging operations that had moved west to Minnesota, Wisconsin, and eventually the Pacific Northwest. The hotels closed. The saloons shut down. The town that had been defined by logging had to find a new identity. Quiet survivor. Today, Speculator still exists with a permanent population of around 300 to 400 people. It's now a small resort community, catering to tourists who come to the Adirondacks for hiking, fishing, and enjoying the recovered forests. But walk through town and you can see the ghost of what it was. Old buildings that once housed logging companies. Former hotels now converted to other uses. Streets that once bustled with loggers, now quiet and peaceful. The forests have recovered remarkably. The Adirondacks are once again covered with trees, though they're young forests compared to the giants that were cut. Wildlife has returned. The rivers run clear again. Nature has healed the wounds, though the scars remain visible if you know where to look. Old logging roads overgrown with brush, stone foundations from sawmills, isolated cemeteries where loggers who died in the camps were buried. Speculator reminds us that ghost towns don't always become completely abandoned. Sometimes they survive, but transformed, shadows of their former selves. Their original reason for existence gone, but the community adapting to endure. It's a different kind of ghost town, still breathing, but haunted by the memory of what it once was. Part 5. Batsto, New Jersey. Iron in the Pine Barrens. Industrial village in the Pines. Batsto, New Jersey, seems an unlikely place for a ghost town. It's located in the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey, just an hour from Philadelphia. It was one of the most important iron-producing communities in colonial America. Founded in 1766, Batsto had an iron furnace that produced weapons, tools, and other iron goods for the Revolutionary War and beyond. The Pine Barrens, despite seeming desolate, had everything needed for iron production: bog iron ore in the streams and swamps, unlimited timber for making charcoal, and water power from rivers and creeks. Batsto grew into a complete industrial village with the ironworks at its center, surrounded by worker housing, a mansion for the ironmaster, a general store, a grist mill, and all the infrastructure of a self-sufficient community. At its peak in the early 1800s, Batsto employed over 1,000 people in the ironworks and related industries. The furnace operated year-round, producing high-quality iron that was shipped to Philadelphia, New York, and beyond. During the War of 1812, Batsto iron was crucial for the American war effort, producing munitions and military supplies. Life in the Barrens. Living in Batsto meant being part of an industrial operation isolated in the wilderness. The Pine Barrens were and remain a strange landscape. Vast stretches of stunted pine and oak forest, acidic soil, dark tea-colored streams. It's a landscape that seems harsh and unforgiving. Yet the iron industry thrived there for over a century. Workers lived in company-provided housing, simple frame houses for families, boarding houses for single men. The ironmaster lived in a mansion that still stands today, a Georgian-style house that seems incongruous in the piney wilderness. The contrast between the workers' modest homes and the ironmaster's mansion reflected the rigid class structure of the time. Work at the furnace was hot, dangerous, and exhausting. Men worked in shifts, tending the furnace, hauling ore and charcoal, casting iron into molds. The heat in summer was oppressive. Working near a blast furnace when the outside temperature was 90 degrees was nearly unbearable. Injuries were common: burns, crushed fingers and feet, lung problems from breathing, smoke, and fumes. But Batsto was also a community. Children attended school. Families worshiped together in church. There were social gatherings, celebrations, and the daily interactions that create community. People married, raised families, grew old, and were buried in the local cemetery. For many families, multiple generations worked at Batsto, their entire lives defined by the rhythm of the iron industry. Industrial evolution. Batsto's decline came not from resource exhaustion, but from technological change. In the mid-1800s, the iron industry shifted from small charcoal-fired furnaces to large coal-fired operations near Pennsylvania's anthracite coal fields. These new operations could produce iron more cheaply and in greater quantities than places like Batsto. By the 1850s, Batsto had ceased iron production. The furnace was shut down, never to operate again. Some residents left to find work at other iron furnaces or in the growing industrial cities. But the village didn't die immediately. It transformed into a glass-making center, taking advantage of the abundant silica sand in the Pine Barrens. The glassworks operated for several decades, producing window glass and bottles. But eventually, that industry also moved elsewhere, seeking better transportation and markets. By the early 1900s, Batsto's industrial era was over. The population dwindled. Buildings were abandoned. Nature began reclaiming what humans had built. Preserved village. In 1954, the state of New Jersey purchased Batsto and eventually incorporated it into Wharton State Forest. Today, Batsto Village is a historical site where many buildings have been restored and preserved. You can visit the Iron Master's Mansion, tour worker homes, see the general store, and explore the ruins of the furnace and other industrial structures. Walking through Batsto today is like stepping back in time. The village layout is intact, the central street lined with homes, the mansion overlooking everything, the store and post office, the grist mill by the stream. The Pine Barrens surround everything, the forest having reclaimed the land that was once cleared for charcoal making. What makes Batsto particularly interesting is how complete the story is. Unlike Western ghost towns where buildings have collapsed or been removed, Batsto preserves the entire structure of an 18th and 19th century industrial village. You can see how the workers lived, how the Iron Master lived, how the industrial operation was organized. It's a window into early American industry and the communities it created. The irony of Batsto is that it's a ghost town in one of the most densely populated states in America, surrounded by millions of people, yet isolated in the Pine Barrens, as remote feeling as any Western ghost town. The wilderness that provided the resources for its iron industry has returned, and Batsto sits in the forest like a time capsule. Preserved and protected, its industrial noise replaced by birdsong and wind through the pines. In closing, 5 more ghost towns, 5 more stories. We've now journeyed through 25 abandoned places across America. And what have we learned? That towns die in countless ways, from exhausted resources, technological change, environmental disaster, economic shifts, and simple obsolescence. But also that every town, no matter how small or remote, was home to real people living real lives. From Molson's extraordinary move across an international autos, transformation from industrial powerhouse to forest village, from Fayette's company town control to Gilman's toxic legacy. From Speculator's adaptation to survival, each story reminds us that communities are fragile things, dependent on forces often beyond their control. What strikes me most about this collection of ghost towns is their diversity. We've seen mining towns and logging towns, iron towns and zinc towns, company towns and frontier towns. We've traveled from sea level to 11,000 feet, from desert to forest, from Alaska to the deep south. America's ghost towns tell the entire story of American expansion, industry, and change. These places also remind us that what we build doesn't last forever. The furnaces of Fayette are cold. The forests of Speculator have regrown. Gilman sits sealed and toxic. Molson exists in two places at once, both abandoned. Batsto's industry is silent. Yet, in each case, something remains. Buildings, ruins, memories, stories. The ghosts endure even when the communities are gone. As you drift into sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of these forests and mountains, these industrial villages and frontier towns. You might hear the sound of logging saws in the Adirondacks, or the roar of blast furnaces in the Pine Barrens, or the creak of buildings being moved across the Canadian border. You might feel the elevation of Gilman's clifftop, or walk the streets of Fayette when they still echoed with workers' footsteps. These ghost towns are America's forgotten places, but they're not lost. They exist in memory, in the landscape, in the stories we tell. They remind us where we came from, what we sacrificed to build this nation, and what we've left behind. They're monuments to ambition and endings, to communities that tried and succeeded for a while before fading into silence. Rest now and let the ghosts keep watch. They've been waiting here for decades or centuries, patient and persistent, holding their stories close. And as long as someone listens, as long as someone remembers, these ghost towns will never truly die. They'll just sleep like you're about to sleep, peaceful and still, waiting for the next person to discover them and wonder about the lives lived in these now silent places.